welcome back to this still untitled series where I get to sit down with amazing authors and interview them about something they're passionate to share. Today, we're with Dr. Amy S. Kaufman, the author of The Traitor of Sherwood Forest. Penguin Random House, ooh, there it is, describes this book as an immersive, sultry, heart-pounding, historical reimagining of the Robin Hood ballads, told through the piercing eyes of one of his spies. Dun, dun, dun. So we're going to be talking about adaptation, specifically focusing on Amy's work with Robin Hood. Amy, thank you so much for joining us. I'm so excited to hop in about this.
Thank you so much for having me.
Of course. For those who don't know, you got your PhD on women in medieval literature, Arthurian legend, and contemporary medievalism. Can you talk a little bit about what drew you into that field of study in particular?
Yeah, I was, when I was younger, I was always really into medieval things and like D&D and swords. And, you know, my high school read was The Mists of Avalon. We won't talk about Marian Zimmer Bradley right now. Yeah. So I was really into
a lot of great things to some lovely Arthurian nerds, yes. But
yes, the book is there. And was formative to a lot of us. Although I returned to it in my dissertation in the last chapter, and it definitely hits differently when you're older.
It does. I think it was great for when we were of a younger time.
Yes.
And then, you know, now as we're older, we're able to look more critically at the things we loved and maybe still love aspects of them, but be like, okay, I can see.
Seems like we have to do that a lot lately. Anyway, so I took a course in medieval literature in university, and I went in kind of expecting to find maybe some cool knight stuff, you know, and some cool magic stuff, but I didn't expect to find a lot of interesting agency with women. But I was really surprised. My professor in that course, he gave us a lot of Icelandic sagas, a lot of Arthurian legend, and it was just this world of vibrant women that I didn't know existed. You know, they're casting magic and they're in athletic competitions and they're fighting and they're doing politics and they're winning wars and losing wars. And it just felt like it opened up the past for me, because when we looked at popular culture, especially when I was growing up, you didn't see a lot of examples of that. You saw either oppressed woman, or you saw love interest woman, or you saw evil woman, right? And you didn't see this kind of broad spectrum of women. So after that, I knew immediately what I wanted to study. I just wanted to delve into that world.
Absolutely. But bearing that in mind, with the medieval, I do know that there are, and we'll talk more about this as we go through, with Robin Hood, a lot of things have been added since the original ballads, as she will tell us more. Why Robin Hood's in particular? Because you've mentioned magic and the amazing women, and if I recall correctly, the original ballad of Robin Hood was not very femme-centric. I believe Maid Marian was not added until like centuries later.
Correct.
Well?
Yeah, there was no Maid Marian. He worshipped the Virgin Mary instead. And the sheriff's wife has a role, like she does in my book. But other than that, there are almost no women. And if there are women, they are anonymous and invisible. But I came to Robin Hood a lot later. I came to Robin Hood when I was teaching. I used to teach medieval myths and legends as professor. And what I always try to get my students to talk about, because they would come in as fans of something in medieval popular culture, was the difference between the medieval legend and the way that we interpreted those legends now, whether that was an Arthurian story or, you know, Vikings or anything. I liked to bring them back to the original, and then we would talk about the difference. And mostly, you know, what that difference says about us. You know, how do we see the world differently from medieval people? How do we adapt these legends to kind of suit our political needs or our emotional needs? But Robin Hood honestly was one of the biggest differences between the medieval representation and the modern. And it just nagged at me. It fascinated me. I wanted to know why. I wanted to understand. So the medieval Robin Hood he's very chaotic. He's a trickster. He can be a total jerk. He's very often selfish and arrogant, and yet medieval people really loved him. They saw him as a hero, and I was fascinated by that. I wondered what the draw was, and it just stayed in the back of my mind until I decided to start writing about it to explore it.
Why do you think they were drawn to that? Obviously, I'd love to talk after that about the major differences you've seen between medieval and modern Robin Hood. But that's very interesting. Just jumping off from the beginning, why was that such a draw to the medieval people?
I think he was a channel for their anger. And I feel like that makes it very relevant today. He was popular.
What do you mean? What do you mean?
I don't know why. He was popular, especially among peasants. And there was actually a 15th century chronicle that complained about how much the peasants liked him when he was just this common criminal. But he channeled their anger. He disrupted authority, whether that was church authority or royal authority. And he pulled one over on the people in power in a time when power felt oppressive and impossible to change. I honestly, I don't like to make this comparison a lot because it feels almost cheap, but it reminds me a little bit of the situation with Luigi Mangione, right? He did something violent and angry for legal reasons, if he did what he was accused of doing. And people loved it, and they saw him as their hero kind of everywhere, even though if, again, the accusations are true, he did it out of revenge. He didn't do it to save the world. And yet it channeled something in people's spirits, right? They felt like they couldn't change the system, so they cheered for somebody who could, no matter how he did it.
Absolutely. Well, further on that point, we've seen whom he was back then versus how would you interpret the modern Robin Hood these days? What makes him different? I
feel like the modern Robin Hood is often more of an institutionalist. So he's more about restoring order than disrupting power. Because the modern Robin Hood is gentrified very often. Very often he is a nobleman who has lost his land, and he gets into activism because he's trying to get his stuff back. And that's not the case for the medieval Robin Hood. He was a commoner. He had no land. He didn't have a specific personal beef with the king, except that the king got mad that he was doing crimes in the woods. It wasn't about restoring his place among the powerful or among the nobility. In fact, in the medieval Robin Hood, in the Jest of Robin Hood, there's a period where, and I didn't put this in the book, so it's not a spoiler, there's a period where Robin Hood runs off to join the king. He sort of makes nice with the king, and he gets invited to the court. And after a year, he's gone broke because he realizes he has to hire all his friends. There's no actual loyalty. He has to pay everybody to be his friend. And he misses just running around in the woods and having true friendships and a true existence, as opposed to this kind of fake currying favor and kissing up to nobles. And he leaves. And it sort of ties into his disappearance and the fading away of his heroism. I think it's really different that the modern Robin Hood wants to join the upper class and is seen as an upper class person coming in to save the oppressed, as opposed to being one of the oppressed who fights back among them.
And I know we talked about this a little bit when we first started planning out how we were going to discuss this, but the idea of him being used as a tool, as propaganda for King Richard of things are bad right now because you have bad establishment.
Because you have a
not
bad
establishment
king, right?
Is bad.
Yeah. And, King John is not even the king in the medieval ballads. It's King Edward. And King Edward, despite his reputation for cruelty, he is seen by history as successful because he colonized and made a lot of war. He was a terrible person. I used Edward first. There's a lot of controversy about which Edward it is. I chose Edward the First for a lot of reasons. I wrote a Substack about it if anybody really wants to nerd out. But so him fighting King John is also a later addition. It comes in the Renaissance when John is universally loathed So he becomes a safe target. King Richard had nothing to do with the medieval legends. So he becomes
Richard had
a
really
royalist.
very little to do with England. If you look at history, it's kind of interesting. You're like, if only he had come back. And it's like,
The other thing is, like until recently, I think they're starting to undo this. I think the Russell Crowe movie called that into question. But there was in the 20th century, Robin was glamorized for his connection to the Crusades, which is not a great thing to celebrate. But that's part of the Richard tie-in, right? It was like, oh, well, he's the hero. They were on crusade together. Yay. That is not
great, you guys.
The origin story of an altruistic hero unless you reject it. So
So is there anything from the modern idea of Robin Hood that you think like, oh, okay, a lot of this is not great, but I do like this is a nice change. It's okay if the answer is no.
I should say I do enjoy modern Robin. I love the modern Robin Hood. I mean, I grew up on the Disney Fox. I loved Men in Tights.
Him.
Men in Tights doesn't really hold up, but it was fun at the time.
It's still a little fun. It's very much of its time down to a lot of the jokes do not make sense if you weren't like, apart from like, that is not aged well. We know so much better now. Yeah. But even like the ones that were fine, you're going, oh, this is so steeped in like referencing something that happened around this time or a few years prior. It just doesn't
basically a spoof of the Kevin Costner movie, right? It's a spoof of it, and if you didn't watch the Kevin Costner movie, that movie will make no sense. Anyway, so I do like the modern adaptations, and I think the thing that I like the most is the sense that Robin Hood is kind of a verb. Like he's a heroic spirit that can be attached to anyone. There are a lot of feminist retellings that use a female Robin Hood, and so anybody can kind of take up that role of the hero behind the mask. And I do like that. It's got nothing to do with the medieval Robin Hood at all, but that doesn't mean it isn't great. It is still pretty
absolutely
great.
So in your opinion, why was it so important? I mean, I feel like you've somewhat answered this already, but like specifically to pull your Robin Hood, it sounds kind of solely from those medieval ballads of like, no, we want this version. We don't really want to pull anything. Because I know some adaptations will go, we're going to pull a little here, we're going to pull a little here, and there's nothing wrong with that either. But for this story, you clearly, like, you needed this version. Are you able to talk about that a little without too many spoilers?
Yeah, so it's because it was in the Renaissance, in the 16th century, that everything began to change for Robin Hood. The character that we know now was mostly born in the Renaissance. So it is just those earlier ballads that have the character that I wanted to use in my book. The one who is not nobly born, the one who doesn't hook up with Maid Marian because Marian doesn't exist, the one who can be chaotic and cruel. Some of those things carry over into some later legends, but the Robin Hood standard changes in the Renaissance. So it's really only those earlier ones that have this character.
I love that. Is there anything you would say other than his humble origins that's like, for you, like this is really part of the heart of Robin Hood that gets lost in a lot of the modern adaptations?
I think it's important that our heroes don't have to be perfect and that our agents of change don't have to be perfect. I think one thing that's lost in the modern world is the sense that heroism can be complicated and heroes can be complicated, and they don't have to be squeaky clean to make a difference. And they don't even have to end well. They don't have to be nice to everyone. But understanding what heroism has been throughout time, before this time, in the medieval world and the ancient world, it was making a difference in some way, but not necessarily someone who had to be on a pedestal, who had to be idolized. Heroes in earlier times were seen as more human. They could be flawed, and you learned from their acts of bravery, but you also learned from their failures, and you learned from the things that went wrong. You learned from their arrogance and the mistakes that they made. So it's kind of meant to be the whole story, the hero's journey. Right?
No, I love that. I think we absolutely have gotten very puritanical about our heroes.
That's the word I was looking for.
We're just, a country founded by Puritans. Why would the modernity, like in colonialism, why would that? Anyway. But I love what you're talking about. Like our heroes can be human. And it reminds me, my wife is very much into Arthurian lore and legend. And one of our favorite stories is Gawain and the Green Knight. And his entire journey is about, you made mistakes and that's okay. You did the best with what you could. And I love that so much.
The knights screw up all the time. Arthur screws up all the time. It's all about their mistakes and the very human flaws that make them fall. I think, that's the beautiful part of the story. And I do feel like when everything has to work out great and everybody has to do the right thing all the time, it's nice, but it's also kind of childlike, which if that's what you want, go for it. Absolutely. But I also feel like that can keep us from growing.
Oh, I love that. That's really beautiful. The Traitor of Sherwood Forest is written from the perspective of a peasant woman named Jane. Can you talk about why that perspective specifically was very important in telling this story?
Yeah, two primary reasons. One is that as a peasant woman, Jane is the exact kind of person that Robin Hood was supposed to be saving. So she becomes kind of a mirror character for us. She has a lot of illusions about him that get stripped away as she joins up with the gang. She's a person who's supposed to have no agency and at first gets agency through Robin and then sort of learns how to get it on her own. The other reason is that we don't see a lot of peasant women in historical fiction. And I think that goes back to what I was talking about earlier, that idea that women didn't have much agency, were highly oppressed, and therefore if they weren't exceptional women like queens or princesses or warriors or whatever, that they weren't interesting enough to write about, right? They were invisible, that their whole lives were oppression and doom. But if you look at the medieval world, women are hugely vibrant parts of society. They work, they brew beer, they fall in love, they break hearts, they get their hearts broken, they get involved in village politics. They're healers. Like, they have huge roles and we don't get to hear their stories. So it was important to me that I didn't just reintroduce a carbon copy of Maid Marian with a different name, or even Maid Marian herself, because Maid Marian, again, is part of the gentrification of the story. She's brought in to make Robin Hood respectable. Side note, segue little.
No, I love that. Let's talk a little bit about that, because I'm sure a lot of people who aren't familiar with Maid Marian being a later edition or his origins as a ballad of like, well, why didn't you just write this from the perspective of Maid Marian? Why'd you make someone new? Sorry, that should not have had a little voice that was adding a judgment on top of that. If you don't know, it's a very valid question, honestly. Yeah. And we've talked a little bit about why, but like, can you talk a bit more about Marian and her evolution and how she very much changed a lot about the tone of the original myth?
One thing I will say is that there's a theory that Marian comes from a folk tradition that's kind of from a fertility festival, and that Marian had a shepherd.
We're going back to Myths of Avalon.
Yeah, that Marian had a shepherd lover who was named Robin, and there's an idea that the stories were conflated, but she retains. Yeah, isn't that interesting?
From that to but now you're the cousin of the king.
Yeah, but that's an argument. I'm not going to make a judgment about whether or not it's the same Marian, because those names are fairly common, but it's definitely possible that they pulled the medieval people and people in the Renaissance conflated legends all the time. So it's definitely possible that they
hear things word of mouth
together.
You can't read. You're just like, oh.
Or you just don't have access to the text, right? Because it's chained to a desk in a monastery.
Absolutely. In Latin, probably.
In Latin. Yeah. But yeah, so Marian was brought in at the same time that Robin Hood joined the nobility and the gentry. And there was kind of a common sense that running around in the woods with other men was something that you did when you were young, but when you grew up and you became a man, then you had to have a partner. And Marian, early on, she always had a personality. You know, she was always part of fighting back with Robin Hood. But it does two things. First of all, medieval Robin Hood was devoted to the Virgin Mary, and that would not stand in Protestant Renaissance England, right? You cannot have...
Too Catholic, can't.
Yeah, you cannot have someone who devotes all of his acts to Mary. And he stops and he prays to her all the time. And he even gets abducted because he goes to church to pray to Mary on specific days. So that had to go. And then the sort of homosocial element of hanging out with dudes in the woods and all that brotherhood and loyalty.
We're straight, just Mary.
Had to go, right? If he was going to become a respectable member of society, he had to have a female love interest, right? Who was also a respectable member of society. So Mary herself is not the problem, but the way that she became part of that evolution into something that the nobility could stomach and could even see themselves in. You know, in a way, they very much co-opted the legend from the people. They took it, they made Robin Hood one of their own, and then like you said, they used him as propaganda. They used him to normalize. And there's resistance against that. You see resistance against that in some of the Victorian stories. You see it in some of the early 20th century films. But the overall vibe of Robin Hood is the one who's associated with nobles now.
So how do you feel that your adaptation, The Traitor of Sherwood Forest, for those available now, how do you feel it? Yes! We are not ashamed. Of talking about our own work and being like, it's amazing. Go read it. But how do you feel that it adds to the library of Robin Hood and those who love the legend and the myth?
I feel like it's important to understand the origins of things, if only because it teaches us about ourselves and our expectations and how we see the world. But I am a medievalist, so obviously I'm biased, and I think we should understand the origins of everything.
You gotta understand where it came from to see where it's going.
But I hope that the book has, even though he's not a perfect hero, I hope it has given the medieval Robin Hood kind of a space in the modern imagination, one that I feel was missing, and is kind of a resistance against that upper class narrative, both from Robin's perspective and from Jane's. I think, you know, my main character, Jane, her class critique is really important to the story, and it's subtle. It doesn't hit you over the head, but I think her lived experience in that book and trying to capture a medieval peasant woman's lived experience is as important as telling that original Robin Hood story.
What is your hope that readers take away when reading this book?
That they want to read more medieval stuff.
Heck yeah, that's fine. That's great. I love that.
Yeah, I hope that they look into the past to see the present differently, because I feel like we have so many myths about what the Middle Ages were and how it looked, and those myths often reinforce really restrictive things in the contemporary world. And if we went back and looked to see what it was really like, you know, maybe we could make different decisions about what we think is natural and inevitable for the course of humanity. Small goals.
Small. Just, you know, start small. Work that.
Tiny goals. Yeah.
What advice would you give to writers who want to adapt something with this much canon to go through?
My advice would be don't try to do everything. Focus on
you're going to stop it. My advice would be don't. No, I'm like, Amy.
No. Focus on your vision. Don't try to include all the different variations of legend. Focus on the story that you want to tell, because there is no, when it comes to something like Robin Hood, there is no real original to get back to. Even the early stories that I used were written down centuries after the oral legends were told, right? So this is a legend that people have always adapted for their own purposes. They've always made changes. And, you know, your vision of it is valid, however you want to adapt it.
Love that. So what would you say is the most important thing to keep in mind when adapting a work?
Not everyone's going to like what you do.
I feel like that's just, no matter what you're doing, but especially when you've got an established fan base of some sort as well. Yes.
Yeah, and that's okay too, because there's always going to be a group of people who are looking for that missing story, who want to hear the story that you're telling, and it's important enough to write it for them. No version has to be the authoritative, perfect version. There's a version for everybody, and it might be that you are writing the version that's missing that a lot of people want to hear.
Amazing.
I hope.
No, you could. Yes. Definitive statement without authorial imposter syndrome creeping in.
Yeah, it's just like a shadow.
Amy, thank you so much. You can find this glorious author on Threads and Instagram and Blue Sky, as well as, of course, her website, amyskaufman.com. All of her links are below, as well as her upcoming events this fall in Vancouver and Halifax. And The Traitor of Sherwood Forest is already available for you to purchase in paperback, ebook, and audio wherever books are sold. I am going to be starting the audiobook later this week, so I'm very excited. And if you get a chance to pick it up, drop a line in the comments. And remember, keep things spoiler-free. Thank you so much for watching, and leave your favorite Robin Hood adaptation and why in the comments below. Bye!
Thank you so much.